Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we will continue our roster mania discussions in Counter-Strike 2 in the post-Shanghai major environment that we are in heading into 2025. And this one is going to be about Team Liquid. And of course, it was just announced the day before I put out this video that NertZ had been officially signed to Team Liquid to take over Yakindar's spot after he had been benched earlier in the month of December. Now, there were already a lot of reports and rumors swirling about the fact that NertZ would be joining this team, and there was even kind of some playful social media posts being put out by both NertZ and Twist kind of hinting at this move, and ultimately it did come into fruition. So I kind of wanted to use this video to talk a little bit about the state that Liquid was in when they decided to make this move to bench Yakindar and bring NertZ in, kind of talk a little bit about NertZ and what maybe he can bring to this team, and then kind of discuss Liquid's outlook going forward into 2025 in the opening tournaments that they will play at with this lineup. And so really, when you kind of look at where Team Liquid left off at the end of last year and heading into 2025, they were certainly a top 10 team in the world, and you could even make the argument that they were top 8. I think that they are 9th in the Valve rankings, just behind Heroic, which of course is now essentially Falcons as far as, you know, them taking that core of players and kind of taking over that spot. And I think that's probably pretty fair. You know, Liquid was one of those teams that would always beat the teams ranked at or below their level. They very rarely had any upset losses, but they just couldn't really seemingly beat the teams ranked ahead of them on a consistent basis. So if you kind of look through the timeline of this team, they came together at the Blast Fall groups and they came out guns blazing. You know, they beat VP, they beat Na'Vi twice in 2 different 2-1 series, and ultimately won that to go ahead and solidify themselves a good spot in the Blast Fall finals. We then saw them go to IM Cologne, where they had to go through the play-in, and they beat Pain and Furia to make it into the main event. But once they were there, they lost to FaZe. And this would become a pattern. We'll talk about this here as they lost to FaZe in some really close games, but then beat Furia and Complexity, so kind of establishing themselves at the top of the Americas food chain, but then ultimately lost to FaZe in a rematch in some overtime maps, which knocked them out of the tournament. Then you go to EPL Season 20. They had a top 8 finish here. And while they were able to beat teams like INTZ, Virtus Pro, and Complexity, again, teams ranked at or, below their level, they did lose to Vitality 1-2, and they lost to G2 1-2. So they're getting maps, they're being competitive against these top teams, but they're not able to really score wins against, the top 5 that we kind of had at the time. Then they go to that Blast Fall final that they qualified for in the groups, and they beat Na'Vi twice, and they beat Spirit. So this is the now 3rd time they have been able to beat a top 5 ranked team in a best of 3. But then they went on to lose against Vitality in a very close series. Anubis was overtime. Nuke was 11-13. So very tight series against Vitality, but ultimately still lost that. But then, what do you know? They get knocked out of the tournament by FaZe yet again, just like they did over at Cologne. Oh, and speaking of getting knocked out of tournaments by FaZe, why don't we go to IM Rio, where they won their opener against Complexity, but then lost to Na'Vi 1-2. Again, very tight series. They won the opening map on Inferno. They lost to Ancient 11-13 in the 3rd map, but then they played against FaZe and they got knocked out of the tournament again by FaZe. This is now 3 tournaments that they have been knocked out by FaZe, if I'm counting correctly. Then the Blast World Final, they lost 1-2 to G2 and Vitality. Again, some pretty close games here. They get map wins. They were at this point really establishing themselves as a team that could play Ancient and Anubis to a pretty high level, but their DusT 2 and their Mirage were really becoming a huge problem. And then the Vitality series, they had a really close loss on Nuke to get knocked out of the tournament. Then we saw them come into the Shanghai RMR for the Americas, and they came in as the heavy favorite. But this is where they actually had kind of their first upset loss, I guess you could say. They lost to Wildcard on Inferno in overtime in a best of 1. Now, it was just a best of 1, not a best of 3, so it wasn't some crazy upset, but it was kind of the first time they had slipped and lost to a team ranked below them. But they followed up fine, beat Crew, beat Bestia, and beat Fury in a best of 3 to go ahead and lock in a spot at the Major. In the opening stage, they did great. They went 3-0. They beat Cloud9, which had some talented players on it. They got revenge against Wildcard on the very same map that they had lost to them in overtime on Inferno. And then they beat FlyQuest 2-1 to move on to the elimination stage. Now, once there, they lost their opening best of 1 to Na'Vi, but then quickly followed up with wins over Gamer Legion and Furia to get into the best of 3 sequence. And once there, they beat Main Brazil 2-1 in order to lock in a spot in the playoffs. And then once in the playoffs, they did lose to Spirit 0-2. Lost Anubis pretty comfortably, but had a pretty tight game on DusT 2 11-13. And really what you kind of found throughout this process, as far as just performance of the team goes, I mean, I kind of got over their overall results. But again, yeah, they just could not beat the top 5 teams. Yes, they beat Spirit once, they beat Na'Vi twice, but they lost to FaZe every time they played against them, and FaZe knocked them out of like 3 tournaments. They weren't really able to beat Vitality. They weren't ever able to beat G2. They weren't able to get those wins, and I don't think they ever played against Mousesports, so we'll never know how that would have played out. And they also never got to play teams like Mongols or Heroic, which were kind of right where they were, kind of, on the latter end of the top 10, which would have maybe told us more about how good this team actually was. But the reality is that Heroic and Mongols did more than Liquid to impress you. Heroic, I think, had a more impressive major run. They actually beat Na'Vi in the best of 3 to make the playoffs, and just generally looked strong in Shanghai throughout the entire process. Mongols obviously looked incredibly strong in Shanghai as well, and had done well at a couple of smaller tournaments leading up to the major. So Liquid just didn't look quite as impressive. Sure, they were a top 10 team. Sure, they were regularly beating the Americas teams like Furia, Made in Brazil, Complexity, teams along that way. They would beat like weaker-ish, European teams like Virtus Pro or Ints, or Gamer Legion, or any of these squads. But yeah, they just couldn't get the big quality wins. And player performance-wise, look, Twist was taking over the IGL role, so he was having to kind of learn this new role. And he individually played pretty well for an IGL standards, but he obviously fell off from being a star rifler as far as his overall numbers, which was kind of to be expected. There's not many in-game leaders out there who were able to put up massive numbers while also being the IGL of their team. Really the only people that I can think of that come close are people like Blitz from Mongols, or Big Uzera, of course, from his squad over at Pain. Or, you take a look at someone like Twist, essentially, that's kind of really the one. And I mean, you would have like Kixen and Shuei were like okay, don't get me wrong, like especially like entry stats wise, not too shabby, but overall numbers maybe not the best. So there just isn't that many out there, right? And he was basically trying to be this, and he kind of was, but just not to the same star level that Twist was capable of being when he played on FaZe, or when he played on Team Liquid as just a star rifler and not a leader. And so he's still kind of going through the growing pains of being an IGL, which we'll talk about in a second. The NAF, he really was a solid star player for this team, particularly at the Shanghai run. He was their best player, was really having a standout performance. I think he even had some weird interview with Banks where he talked about increasing his mount sensitivity so he could make bigger plays and hit and he was being a little bit more aggressive on the extremities and trying to be a little bit more flexible. He's always been known as an extremity role player, but it felt like he was trying to be a little bit more proactive and make plays, or even come off the extremities and kind of come in with Twist and try to do some entry work on a map like Anubis, for example. And he was doing quite well at that. And then you had Ultimate, who was kind of like hot or cold. Like, he came off really hot at their first couple of events as a just really aggressive opper. He was going for more opening attempts on the T side than probably any other opper in the game other than Ziwu, which is kind of an unfair comparison because Ziwu was doing that with an AK because he was kind of playing a hybrid role. So yeah, he was really coming in aggressive, and he was also very aggressive defensively, and he was very successful. But then he fell off a cliff, at some of the events leading up to the RMR in the major, the Blast World Final, he didn't do great. Rio, Blast World Final, all that jazz. Ultimate looked like he was down the dumps, but he really had a resurgence at the Americas RMR and throughout the course of the major, and really has kind of had the uptick again, where it feels like he's kind of figuring out a balance of what he can go for and what he can't. He still is very aggressive on both sides of the map. He hasn't completely lost his style of play, but it seems like he's kind of tempering it a little bit, and kind of finding his rhythm, and still definitely could be a star for this team next to NAF, in my opinion, going forward. Then you look at someone like JKS, and I thought he played his role fine, being an extremity player, being a side anchor. There is an exception to that where he plays Yard on Nuke, which is kind of a more active position. He actually does pretty well playing that role. And he, even on Anubis, kind of being the A extremity player on the T side, he would be quite active there and actually help with entry work on the A site, and, in other instances, get a little bit more active on the extremities as well. But then let's talk about Yekindar, the guy who wound up getting benched to bring in NertZ. And look, Yekindar's individual level has been pretty low for the majority of 2024, and even further back than that. It seemed like he never really recovered from his IGL stint, if we're being honest, as far as individual performance. There were moments in time throughout the course of the year, including the major, where his entry stats actually got back to a pretty reasonable level for entry fragger. This guy was always taking well over 30% of this team's opening attempts. There were times where he's even up near 40%. He definitely was just the tip of the spear, like in the biggest way possible. I don't know if anybody else took as many opening attempts as Yukendar did. Again, there are a handful of entry fraggers who were above 30%, but Yukendar, again, sometimes would breach 40%, which is insane, level of opening attempts to take for the T side. And there were moments where his success rate were incredibly low. Like if you look at events like the Blast World Final or Rio or the Blast Fall Final, EPL, like he just was not really able to like fulfill that role of creating openings for his team and creating opportunities that NAF and Twist and others could follow up on. But at the major itself and during the Americas RMR, he did kind of get back up to like a mid 40% success rate, which is pretty solid. It's not the best. There are most of the best entry fraggers in the world are going to be in the high 40s or low 50s. And if you get in the 50s, you're really exceptional at that point. But he got to a decent level to where he was certainly helping, but it just felt like he was never quite getting the overall numbers you wanted in other facets of the game, defensively, mid rounds, things of that nature. It just wasn't really bringing the value. And so it certainly made sense that this team was going to have to make a change, when it came to just needing a little bit more firepower, particularly needing a little bit more of an opening force, because there wasn't really any other aggressors on this team besides Yukendar and Ultimate as an opper. And that's really hard to do on the T side and really make that work. Twist would occasionally have events where he would be in kind of the 20% opening attempt range, which is pretty normal for an entry IGL, like a Kixen or a Shuhei or an Apex or something along those lines. But there would also be events where he would be really low on opening attempts and was kind of being more of a mid to late round specialist. Obviously, NAF and JKS are your extremity players, so you're not expecting them to go for many opening attempts. But I will say that they did have a little bit of a leap. I think they were kind of in the 12 to 13% range, kind of with the beginnings of this roster, but then kind of increased to like 16, 17% later on. So they go for a little bit more to try to create a little bit more balance on the team. But it was still very much Yukendar or Ultimate as an opper, which again is very hard to do. And Yukendar's rifles actually is pretty good. So he did kind of help out, but they were missing a little bit of something consistently for an opening. And they also just didn't really have a good map pool. And I think this is just the limits of Twist IGLing at the time. I think that he was trying to learn a lot about becoming an in-game leader for a team that's meant to be a consistent tier 1 contender. And, obviously he has gotten to play alongside some of the best IGLs out there. He's gotten to play against, play with like Sean Garrett's and Nitro, some of the best of Americas. He got to play alongside Kerrigan on FaZe. Like he has had that ability to kind of learn from some of the best for sure, but it's still different doing it. Right. And so there's a lot to do, just basics, just fundamentals, and then you start kind of thinking about specializing in maps. And I will say they got their Ancient into an Anubis to a really high level. I think they ended the year with like a 6-1 record on an Ancient and a 13-3 record on Anubis, so they were quite good in those two maps. But that's really where it kind of peters out. Like the only other map that they had going for them was Inferno, where they had a 9-7 record overall, but they had, I think they won 4 of their last 5 games to end the year. So their Inferno was on a bit of an upswing, and their Ancient Anubis were good. So they had 3 maps that were solid, but their DusT 2 was really, really poor. They lost their last 7 games in a row on it, and most of those games they had 7 rounds or less scored, so they were really struggling on DusT 2. It seemed like they just could not really figure out really either side of the map. It was really odd because DusT 2 seems like one of those maps where you feel like with enough talent you can kind of just figure it out. They just never did. Then their Mirage also was a big weak point. They were 3-5 for the year with the lineup. And then Nuke, they had won 4 of their last 5 games, even though a lot of those losses were close. And their overall record, though, still wasn't that great. So basically, it's like you got Ancient, you got Anubis being their best. Inferno was solid. It was coming around, upper trajectory. And then Nuke was very hit or miss, but then their Mirage and DusT 2 were very poor, and they didn't play Vertigo. So that was kind of a big problem. And really, when you look at them tactically, like on maps like Ancient Anubis, where they were at their strongest, they had a very good, default setup. They were able to play from that default in mid-round pretty well. They were able to mix in faster executes or fast set pieces and things of that nature, particularly on Anubis and Ancient. Even Anubis, I could watch them throughout the course of the year add new plays to the playbook over time. Like I would see them add new executes I hadn't seen them use earlier in the year. Particularly some of the A-pop plays that they were using at the Blast World Finals and some of the fakes that they were throwing on Anubis were not things that they were capable of earlier in the year. So I saw a lot of growth from them tactically on Ancient and Anubis in particular, but their DusT 2, yeah, they had a default. Yeah, they kind of understood some things, but it's like they just couldn't really figure out how to threaten middle or threaten mid to B splits, and they were really more pigeonholed into like B set pieces or just going for like your typical spawn based plays at long A or cat, and they just couldn't really quite figure that out. Inferno, they got to a point where they had a pretty good default and solid fundamentals of like pressuring areas and falling back or committing or recommitting. So I felt like they were pretty good there. But then their Mirage, they also just couldn't really figure out. You know, even when they were trying to follow the meta of going for more of like the 4-1 and 3-2 splits and not really playing default, they just didn't seem to like have a polished enough mid game to get them through. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we're left with, where they were lacking firepower. They're lacking opening power in particular, except for the rare events where Yekindar actually was entering decently. And their map pool was just limited. You know, it felt like Twist had hit his ceiling as an IGL. He ran out of runway, you know, to make things happen this year. Now, obviously, you know, during this time that we're getting ready for Events 2025, this is where he has the opportunity to try to fix this team's DusT 2, fix this team's Mirage. You know, then you have to decide, now that, you know, Vertigo was your permaban, that map's out the pool, now Train's in. Are you going to make Train your permaban? Or are you going to ban one of your weaknesses like DusT 2 or Mirage and try to be a Train team and try to jump on that ship early and try to use that to your advantage? Like, that's something they're going to have to think about. But getting to NertZ, oh man, I know what to say. Like, NertZ is just a fucking fantastic player. I mean, this guy is a stud. He is a true star player. He's an aggressive rifler on T sides, but he's not your traditional entry fragger. He's more of a, he can entry on certain occasions. Like if you watch how he plays DusT 2, for instance, he definitely could do some entry work on that map. But then you kind of look at some of the other maps that Heroic were good at, like Ancient. He was a mid player on T side, so it was more about, you know, yes, he would help take mid control and help establish it and maybe get some opening picks that way. But he was more of like a aggressive lurk threat or a trade fragger on executes behind Tessus and Kixen. You know, that's where he really kind of thrived. And if you look at a map like Anubis, he was an extremity player. He played outside A. And yes, he could pressure A and be a nuisance there and find cool timings and, you know, pressure it solo. But he was also just very good at being a trade fragger behind Tessus when they were going for B splits, and he was kind of following Tessus in like through B connector while the rest of the guys were attacking B long. And so again, kind of more of a pocket, like in the pocket trade fragger on that map. And then Mirage was a map where he was just incredibly mobile. He could pressure window, he could pressure connector, coming from underpass, coming from top middle. He had different ways he could route himself into connector and window to pressure. Obviously, he could help just trade frag on set pieces on A site, or if they did a, you know, apartments pop on the B side, he could, you know, be kind of behind Tessus and again, be kind of that second guy, that star rifler of the team. He did have a pretty high opening attempt rate on the T side. Like he was in the mid 20% range, slightly lower than Tessus, the true entry of Heroic. So he could do some entry work. And I think at times at the major, he even like crossed like the 30% threshold in opening attempts on the T side and had at times an over 50% success rate and was never really lower than the high 40s. So don't get me wrong. Like he can entry, he can go in first, but he's not the same type of just like pure entry that Yekindar was, where Yekindar was like going in first on site executes almost relentlessly. You know, I do think that NertZ is capable of doing that and probably will do that in some scenarios, but he's probably best as like your second guy in. That's probably where you want him. You probably want, if Twist is going to IGL and not really be able to fulfill the star rifler role, you probably want Twist going in first to set up NertZ. Or you want maybe like Ultimate, if he doesn't have an op in his hands, maybe he's going to be kind of one of the guys leading in with Twist and then NertZ kind of being the follow-up. Or again, we saw some signs of NAF and JKS on the extremities willing to be a little bit more proactive, so maybe he can kind of pair up with one of those guys and go for a pressure play. So there's going to be options there. You know, I think NertZ will fit into this team pretty well. We're not going to necessarily have to go through all of the spots, but I will say for NertZ, like the only spots where he would be kind of a 1-for-1 for Yekindar, since that is the person he is going to be replacing, is going to be on DusT 2 on the T side. He could basically take Yekindar's role there, and the team won't really have to change much, although they probably need to change some things because they weren't performing well on that map. And then he did play B connector on the CT side of Anubis, which was Yekindar's position. So those are the two things that he is 1-for-1 with Yekindar, but on other areas, you know, he conflicts with Twist a lot on the T side, like Ancient Middle. You know, that's a spot that Twist plays, for example. Anubis playing A side, that's a spot that JKS plays. Mirage, he could probably fit just fine. I think NAF was kind of their B to underpass player, but, you know, I'm sure NertZ won't mind just playing middle with Twist or something like that, so that probably won't be a problem. And so really ideally, and then obviously NertZ didn't play Inferno because Heroic Bandit, so I don't really know what you're going to do there. Time will tell. But probably what'll happen in an ideal world is if, because Heroic also played Ancient Anubis a fair amount, or quite good at it. So there's some, similarities there. And what'll probably happen on a map like Ancient is JKS will continue to play outside A. Either DusT or NertZ will play mid, and then the other will play B control with NAF. That's probably what's going to happen. I think it'd be best just to let NertZ continue to play middle and just let DusT and NAF pair up on B control. And then let DusT be an aggressor inside B cave and call the shots from there, and then let NertZ just do his thing at middle and be that guy. But I could see NertZ being an aggressor on B cave and just being a B entry type player as well. Like, either one of them can do it. I'm sure they'll figure it out over time. And then as for the CT side, again, both DusT and NertZ were mid players on CT Ancient, so one of them's going to have mid and one of them's going to have to play like B with NAF, and I just don't know which way they're going to go. I would say let NertZ kind of have whatever role he wants and DusT take the sacrifice. Probably makes the most sense, but we'll see what happens. On Anubis, I think what would make the most sense is for NertZ to move away from the A extremity, let JKS keep that, and then put NertZ in a more active role either at middle or at Canal. That would be kind of what I think would be best. He's already kind of used to pathing like Canal to be connector anyway because he would follow Tessus on Heroic, but now he'd be leading it with JKS in those situations, and then he could just kind of trade in behind JKS on A executes or something like that. So we'll just have to see. And then on the CT side, he'll just be able to continue to play Beacon, and then everything else will stay the same for Liquid. On DusT 2, again, NertZ is basically a 1-for-1 on the T side, so DusT and NertZ will be kind of the main entries, and then NAF and JKS will play the extremities. And then NertZ and DusT will just be the rotators on CT sides, while JKS and NAF are the anchors. Doesn't really matter what side of the map. We'll just have to find out. Mirage, again, I think NertZ can just kind of continue to do what he did. I don't think it'll impact things too much on the T side. And then on CT side, that'll be the real interesting one because NertZ and DusT are both A-Con players on Mirage. Again, I think one of them will just have to be the B rotator, and then one of them will be the A-Con player. I think you should just let NertZ have it because, again, he's your star. Like, let him have his spot, and then DusT can play B rotator and play with NAF on the B side of the map. But I know that some IGLs like to be an A-Con because it's a more central position, so you're able to kind of have more information, be able to understand rotations and timings a little bit better, call a little bit better because you're, like, in that central spot. Again, like, a lot of teams take this a different way on whether or not they put a star or an IGL in that spot. So that'll just be something that they have to think about. And then as far as Nuke goes, JKS is the yard player, which is what NertZ used to do. So I'm not sure they could both play yard, and then you could just have like DusT be a roamer while NAF plays lobby. Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And then on the CT side, NertZ was a yard defender like DusT is now, but you could have NertZ just play yard and then let DusT be like the A-door player that Yekindar was and kind of assist outside. Or I'm sure NertZ could probably take that role, kind of be that hybrid that plays A-door but also assist outside with DusT, who's going to be out there as the main yard defender. They'll have to figure that out. But all in all, at the end of the day, the outlook for Liquid goes a little bit something like this. Like, they're already in a top 10 position. This move does give them additional firepower, but they are going to have to kind of restructure the team because I don't think you can just trust in, or force rather, NertZ into just being some pure ram his head up against the wall entry fragger like Yekindar was. Like, I don't think that's the right way to implement him. And so that means that other players are going to have to pick up that slack, whether they want to spread that burden out. And, sometimes maybe NAF is being a little bit more aggressive, leading an extremity, same with JKS, or maybe ultimately he doesn't have an op, he has a rifle in his hands. Maybe you kind of let him go in first and let NertZ trade. I'm sure there are times where you will just let NertZ go in first and just make sure you're supporting him with a good utility. But I think it is also going to come down to DusT being willing to go in first a little bit more, sacrifice himself a little bit more to set up NertZ to still be the star rifle of this team. DusT kind of has chosen on this path to become an IGL. Like this move solidifies that is a long-term venture and not just a short-term experiment. This team could have elected to pick up an IGL and put DusT back into a star rifle role, but they didn't. And so there's clear intent here on what Liquid's trying to do. And so if that's the case, DusT, you're going to have to bite the bullet and probably entry a little bit more now that you don't have like a true entry fragger anymore. Again, you can split duties with NertZ a little bit. I'm sure on a map-by-map basis or a tactic-by-tactic basis, it might make sense for NertZ to go first, sure. But I think Twist is going to have to be a little bit more proactive to facilitate NertZ as more of just a more flexible star rifler. And then look, I just think that at the end of the day, Twist is going to have to continue to grow as an IGL. Again, I think he got Liquid to a pretty good level on how they approached playing Ancient and Anubis. I thought that they were growing in Inferno, though NertZ never really played Inferno with Heroic for a long time, so implementing him into Inferno will be interesting if they decide to keep that map in their pool. But they have got to figure out their DusT 2 and Mirage, and maybe NertZ can help out with that some, bringing in ideas, because Heroic was a pretty damn good Mirage team when it was all said and done at the end of the year. So maybe NertZ can kind of say, hey, this is what Kixon and Saul had cooked up on Mirage. This is the things that I was able to do on Mirage where I felt comfortable. This is how you can facilitate, me, and they can figure out something on Mirage, perhaps. Hopefully that can be something that happens. DusT 2, I think it's just going to be about maybe just, being a little bit more diverse and more than anything else is probably what's going to help them on DusT 2. And then, yeah, they're going to have to decide whether or not they want to be an early train adopter or just pivot their permaban from Vertigo that's now gone into a train permaban. Like, that's up to them. Maybe in the short term, just to get NertZ implement into the roster and up to speed on the rest of the map pool, you kind of don't worry about train right now, and you just kind of worry about the other maps that y'all played regularly. But I could also see Liquid being crafty and picking up train early and kind of using that to their advantage. I mean, I definitely think they have a team that could play it. I don't think that would be a problem. It's just about learning how to call on it, which is, again, that's the biggest thing. Liquid's future will be determined by how Twist evolves as an IGL, how they implement NertZ into this team, how Ultimate continues to evolve as an opper, and that's the show. That's like kind of the big things to keep an eye on to see if Liquid can finally catapult themselves into a true contentious position. Because right now, they are simply a kind of top 10, top 8 team that will, have the occasional playoff run. Yeah, they could make it to the quarterfinals of another major. But are they really going to be able to be a top 5 team that battles with Na'Vi and Vitality and this new Falcons team and, what G2 has in store for next year? What FaZe has in store, that are Kryptonite, who might get a firepower upgrade here. Again, that'll just all come down to, how players mesh and how these players evolve as a team. I certainly think they're capable. They have the talent to do it. There's no doubt about it. It'll just come down to the leadership of the team and how they mesh. So don't want to get into the weeds any more than that. I feel like I've covered everything pretty well. If you folks enjoyed this content, please do hit that like button. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Share the content. Leave a comment down below. I'd love to talk with you down there, engage in some conversation. Trying to do some consistent content and help this channel grow, but I need your help in doing that. So thanks again so much for checking this out, and I'll catch you next time.